This is the Griffin Podcast, episode number 96. We continue with our buyer plan, and the subject on the table is representation. What is dual agency? Are you a home seller or a home buyer who has questions about selling or buying residential property, or an agent who needs a plan, but you can't seem to find an easy way to get your answers out there on the internet? Well, then you're definitely in the right place. I'm Danny Griffin, the founder of The Griffin and the host of the Ask a Griffin podcast. Now, to help you take immediate action to get started in a better direction, if you're a seller, buyer, or agent, we want you to take advantage of our free step-by-step guides that are waiting for you at griffincourses.com. That's Griffin courses.com. All right, let's get started. We are in one of our three plans here today, and it's the buyer plan. And we're early on in that plan. And again, at Griffin Courses, you can see the whole plan at once if you get over there. We're talking about representation because for buyers, even in this modern age, they still don't understand what buyer representation really looks like. And then furthermore, the subject on the table complicates it even more. What is dual agency? What does that even mean? So the first point here is to just give you a quick definition of dual agency. Dual agency must be in writing, number one, okay? But dual agency is when an agent or an agency represents both buyer and seller in the same transaction. Now, just to give you a little bit of a historical background about real estate, I've been around it long enough where buyer agency, especially on the East Coast, wasn't really a thing. The way that the business had been set up for years was always driven, because this is the way it works, listings where somebody lists their property with a real estate agent. It's then put into the multiple listing service and shared amongst agents. Typically, the agent, who's the cooperating agent who would bring a buyer, worked as a sub-agent of the listing agent. So it was really a true caveat emptor, which means buyer beware situation for home buyers for many years. But what would happen is the relationship with the agent who brought the buyer would begin to grow. There'd be a bond. That agent would inform them about how's the market. What are prices like around here? What are people getting, when they pay the money here? So they would get into a relationship that was very similar to a trusted advisor. And they would assume that was the case. Yet from a strange structural standpoint in the business, they weren't technically being represented. And many of them woke up and didn't have a good experience with that sub-agent, and lawsuits proliferated. So the business adopted, and I think it was more in the West Coast before it came to the East Coast, the way I recollect it in my business, buyers began to be exclusively represented by an agent. In fact, exclusive buyer agencies became a thing as well during my tenure in this business. So that left us in a spot where, okay, are we overcorrecting? Do you have to have a buyer's agent? Is it mandatory? Is it best practices? All those questions crop up. So as any pendulum swings left and right to correct a wrong or to right a wrong, there's also a middle ground that's found, and that's what dual agency is. I don't mind dual agency at the Griffin at all, because even if they come directly to me as that agent, I have a certain feeling for doing the right thing by all parties anyway. And my sellers are fully aware that we're there to empower them with information and our insight, but that ultimately it's going to be their decision to say yes or no. And they're just using us as a trusted advisor, a fiduciary. We talked about that in a previous episode. Let me get to the second point, though, before I get too deep on that. I said before, dual agency must be in writing, and that the agent remains responsible during dual agency for confidentiality and accounting for funds. So what does that mean? Well, that means, look, in our business, there's one fundamental thing. If there are material defects with the property that the agent becomes aware of, that the agency becomes aware of, all parties have to be disclosed in that context anyway. So product-wise, that's the deal. And that's why there's always a home inspection recommended at our company. We never recommend you waive your home inspection. That's only at your own risk. Even in a hot marketplace where somebody might push you off and say, well, we don't want a home inspection, I'd still get it for informational purposes to find out whether there's any really blind major item. I would never buy a property that blindly. It just doesn't make any sense. So that's one thing that disclosure talks about in the context of agency. Getting down into dual agency, you're now representing two parties. So obviously, wherever you start, if you start, and it's typical that you would start with the seller, and that seller would say, okay, I'm going to allow you up front. If you get a direct buyer, go ahead. Now, there might be some negotiation on fee and all this other stuff that comes up. Let's just be realists about how that might work. In my case, I'm not really looking to reduce my fee when I have to now represent two people, because I have this responsibility to educate this buyer on the market, on the property they're looking at, and to make sure that all the analyses and values are, and again, they're already looking online, so I want to give insight to all. And plus, when I list a property, and we teach it here at the Griffin, everybody's been informed by the math anyway. The math isn't a secret. So we curate it, organize it, productize it, and give it to both buyers and sellers anyway, so everybody makes an informed decision. Everybody comes to a yes that they wanted to come to. That's our belief system here. But we remain in a position where we have to maintain confidentiality about the buyer's wherewithal and any private financial information, as an example. Really, if the seller has a dire situation and needs to sell, that's an example of confidentiality that needs to be maintained during this dual agency. So again, I think if we stick to product disclosures, we stick to market updates, we stick to any sort of market analysis about the general area, I think what you're doing is empowering everybody at a level in dual agency that they need to be, so that everybody can make an informed decision. Then you're counseling individually about the mortgage acquisition or dealing with their bank on the buy side, and that's all confidential on the buy side. Then on the sell side, dealing with whatever they might have to get, need to get in a sale. All of that's confidential. And then, of course, because you're representing two parties, you become responsible for the accounting of all the funds in the transaction. So whether you're in a state where there's an escrow company, a title company, attorneys, escrow accounts at your bank, whatever it might be, you're responsible for that too. So that's the basic and a formula for success. So really, I'll go back to this. Because if you're listening to this as a potential buyer who might end up in a dual agency, or a seller who might end up in dual agency, I think the key point here is to recognize that, and this is our philosophy at the Griffin, it might not be the same for all brokerages, so understand that. But by fully educating, I'll just really underline and emphasize that, by fully educating both buyer and seller, the disclosed, and in writing, dual agent empowers both parties to make their own fully informed decisions. And in our philosophy here at the Griffin, we just believe that that's best practices anyway. So regardless of whether it's single agency, disclosed dual agency, designated agency, there are a lot of different types of agency depending on what state you're in, including just transactional agents, right? Who have very little to do other than just accounting for certain things. So there's much to be understood, but I think the obvious is, for both seller and buyer, get informed. If you don't understand something, ask. Make sure that your questions are being answered as buyer and seller so that you understand. Ultimately, it's still up to you to make an informed decision. You don't want to make one blindly and just simply trust an agent's advice 100% if it's not congruent with your own desires. Again, you must be realistic. There is a reality to the way that the market works and what the market will bear and what you'll have to pay. There's a reality to that, and that is the agent's job to give you the reality. And your acceptance thereof is a necessary thing, or no transaction is going to happen. But having said that, there's always the buyer beware formula, and I don't mean home buyer, I mean both the seller and buyer. When you are contracting with an agent, you want to beware that the agent can only take you so far, and that you shouldn't have a blind reliance on them. So ask your questions. Let me go back and summarize it this way. Relatively simple subject if we keep it simple. So representation, what is dual agency in the buyer plan is where we're at. And the first point is to recognize that dual agency is when an agent or an agency represents both the home buyer and the home seller in the same transaction. The second point, dual agency must be in writing. So it must be written disclosure, and the agent remains responsible for confidentiality on the sell side and confidentiality on the buy side, and is responsible for accounting for all the funds or the money that gets transacted. The third point is a key point. By fully educating, this is to the agents out there, by fully educating both the buyer and the seller, the disclosed dual agent empowers both parties through that information and insight to make a fully informed decision versus a blind decision. I'll summarize it by saying it this way. Real estate agents and agencies in certain states are allowed to enter into a written, disclosed dual agency relationship with both home buyers and home sellers in the same transaction. The agent remains responsible for confidentiality regarding material personal information and accounting for all funds. Best dual agency practices would call for the agent to properly advise and inform both parties about all pertinent market and property information so that all parties enter into an educated and empowered transaction. Okay, remember, you can take immediate action to get started in the right direction and get educated. Become empowered if you're a seller, buyer, or agent who wants help by getting a copy, isn't open to help, by the way. Be open to help. Is by getting a copy of our free step-by-step guides at griffincourses.com. That's GRIFFIN courses.com. Also, don't forget you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen. We also post our content on YouTube. So don't forget to subscribe to The Griffin Channel. Click on those notifications, and every time we put some of this educational material up there, you'll see it. We'd also appreciate it if you would share our content with home sellers and buyers or real estate agents so that they all get the help that they need. Remember this, though. We say it the same way every time on all our podcasts. In fact, nobody's coming for you. Nobody. So take action and get to work on a plan for buying or selling your next property or becoming a successful real estate agent. Thanks for being here. We'll see you in the next episode.